I stood beneath the flickering pawn shop sign with the velvet box tucked tightly into my coat. It was later than an old woman ought to be out alone, but something about the timing felt right, like the universe had turned its back, and now it was my turn to do the same. I had walked the same streets years ago, young and newly in love, the necklace around my neck, catching sunlight and compliments. Tonight it caught nothing, just the dull yellow buzz of a tired street lamp, and the sound of my own heart saying, "Don't cry now, not here, not yet." I hadn't planned on doing it that night. I'd told myself I'd wait, that maybe something would change. Maybe the hospital would call with a payment plan that didn't feel like suffocation. Maybe one of the kids would check in and ask how I was really doing. But it had been days since I got the bill, and weeks since any of them came by, and I had sat in my kitchen trying to do the math between medicine and rent, and found there was nothing left to count. So I reached for the box, that little velvet tomb that had lived untouched, at the back of my drawer for decades. The clasp was slightly bent, one of the gold links dulled with age, but to me, it was still beautiful. It had been a gift from a man who once looked at me like I was the entire sky. He gave it to me on our wedding day, fastened it around my neck as I wore my mother's dress and said, "This is yours like I am." And for a long time I believed him. The shop bell jangled as I stepped inside, and the man behind the counter barely glanced up. He looked tired too. The kind of tired that doesn't come from working long hours, but from forgetting what you're working for. I didn't want to explain myself, didn't want to say it was for the cardiologist or the prescriptions or the scan they said I needed just to be sure. I didn't want to say that I'd tried to avoid the hospital, that I'd taken aspirin for weeks and waited for it to go away, that I'd lied and told my children I was fine. Instead, I opened the box and placed it gently in front of him. "Just tell me what it's worth," I said. He looked it over, squinting like the weight of time could be measured in grams and carats. "Sentimental?" he asked, like it mattered. "Yes," I said, "but I don't have the luxury of sentiment anymore." He gave me a number. Less than I hoped, more than I expected. I nodded. I didn't ask for more. I didn't argue. I just took the cash and walked out. My hands cold around the folded bills, the warmth from the necklace gone like something unhooked from my soul. No one knew. When I got home, I made tea and sat at the table in the quiet the way I always did. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stared at the teacup as the steam curled upward as if it were trying to say something before disappearing. The next day, the children called. Not all of them, just one. A rushed voice talking over the sound of driving, laughing life, happening somewhere I no longer belonged. They asked how I was. I said I was fine. They didn't ask more. I didn't offer. That was the game we played now. Shallow check-in, safe distance. I wanted to tell them. I wanted to say I sold my wedding necklace to pay for the tests the doctor said I needed. But what would that do? Guilt is a cruel gift to give your child. I've always believed that. So instead I asked about the kids, the weather, the new job. I smiled into the phone and said, "I'm just resting up. Nothing serious." When the call ended, I placed the receiver down and looked at the place on the wall where our wedding photo used to hang. I'd taken it down after the glass cracked during a storm. I never bothered to replace it. Some things once broken feel wrong when restored. That night, I touched the bare skin at the base of my neck before bed, expecting to feel the cold gold against my fingers. But it was gone, and somehow my body remembered before my mind did. I'd worn it so long it had become part of me. Now a part of me was missing. It started with a faintness, a kind of quiet dizziness that crept in while I was washing the dishes. At first I thought I'd stood up too quickly, or maybe hadn't eaten enough that morning. I leaned against the counter and waited for it to pass. It didn't. Instead, it bloomed slowly, wrapping around my chest like a cold hand that wouldn't let go. I sat down at the kitchen table, the one with the chipped edge and the faded placemats, and took slow breaths, in, out, in, out. But the room kept pulsing in and out of focus, like a dream I couldn't wake from. I didn't want to go to the hospital, not because I wasn't scared I was, but because fear is easier to hold than shame. And what I felt more than anything was shame. Shame that I had no one to drive me. Shame that I would have to sign in alone, sit in those 2 bright chairs, alone, be asked next of kin, and have no one listed. Shame that I didn't want my children to know I was there at all. So I called a cab. I told myself I was just being cautious, that it was probably nothing. Maybe my blood pressure, maybe dehydration. I left a note on the counter in case something happened, but I didn't sign it. Just in case. At the emergency room, they asked the usual questions. Was I on any medication, any history of heart issues? Did I live alone? I lied and said my daughter was nearby, that she'd be coming soon. That lie settled between us like a coat I put on too tightly, suffocating and warm. They ran tests, the kind with machines and wires and beeping lights that made me feel more like a malfunctioning appliance than a person. I stared at the ceiling. I counted the tiles. I imagined what my children were doing at that moment. Probably working, probably busy, probably not thinking of me. And maybe that was my fault. Maybe I had taught them too well to not worry, to be independent, to believe their mother could handle anything. They kept me overnight. I hadn't packed a bag. I wore the same clothes into the morning, the hospital blankets scratchy and thin. When the doctor came in, he smiled, polite but tired. He said the test didn't show anything too alarming, but there were signs that should be watched. He recommended a few more test follow-ups just to be sure. I nodded. I always nod. Then came the moment I dreaded most, the paperwork. Insurance, deductibles, costs. It wasn't even the full bill yet, just an estimate, but it made my breath catch. A number I couldn't fold into my budget no matter how many ways I sliced it. A number that made me feel like a burden, like someone who had outlived their usefulness. When I got home, the house was quiet, too quiet. I sat at the table, the bill in my hands, and stared at the spot on the wall where the clock used to hang. I'd taken the batteries out months ago when the ticking started to feel too loud. It still hung there, frozen in time, like it didn't want to admit how long I'd been alone. Later that day, one of my sons called. He was in a rush, said he just wanted to check in. I almost told him. Almost, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. The words caught in my throat, like dry leaves too brittle to say aloud. I'm just resting, I said. I think I caught a little something. He said, drink water, Mom, and hung up. That night I opened my drawer. Not the one with the bills or the medicine, but the one I hadn't touched in years. The one with the old birthday cards, the faded photographs, the handwritten recipe from my mother. And at the very back, wrapped in soft cloth, was the necklace. I unwrapped it slowly. The chain glimmered faintly, catching the soft light from my bedside lamp. I ran my fingers along its length, feeling the slight kink in one of the links. The clasp still worked a little stiff, but reliable like me. I held it up to my neck, not to wear it, but to remember. The weight of it, the warmth it once held, the man who once kissed my shoulder and said, "You look like forever." I closed the box gently. I didn't cry then. That came later. When the envelope came, I already knew what it would say. Hospitals don't send handwritten letters or postcards with kind words. They send statements sterile, unforgiving, exact. I stared at the return address, my hands trembling just slightly, though I tried to keep them still, as if steadiness could somehow make the numbers inside smaller. I waited to open it. Made myself a cup of tea first. Sat by the window where the afternoon light was softer, more forgiving than fluorescent bulbs. I watched the leaves sway in the breeze the same way they used to when I would sit with the children as they did their homework at this very table. Back then, time moved slower. Now it feels like everything is a rush, except the loneliness. That part lingers. I finally broke the seal. The paper unfolded like a verdict. Line after line of charges, labs, scans, emergency services, subtotals and disclaimers, co-payments and patient responsibility. I read it all even though I didn't need to. I knew by the weight of it, both literal and emotional, that it would be too much. Per agent. It may as well have been $20,000. When you're stretching pennies between groceries, heat, and prescriptions, even a few hundred feels like a sentence. I had some savings, yes, but they were for emergencies, birthdays, maybe a bus ticket to visit my sister if I ever got the strength. But this was a different kind of emergency, the kind that doesn't bleed or scream, but still takes from you all the same. I ran my fingers along the necklace box again, still resting on the edge of the dresser where I'd left it the night before. It almost looked like it didn't belong there. Too soft, too lovely, too full of memory for a moment like this. The truth is, I didn't want to part with it. That necklace wasn't just gold, it was a story. The story of a girl who once believed in forever, a woman who wore it through every storm, and a widow who kept it close even when everything else drifted away. I'd worn it the day I buried my husband. I'd touched it each time I looked in the mirror and needed to feel less invisible. But a necklace can't pay a bill. A necklace can't buy you medication, can't fix the steady ache in your chest or the tightness that makes it hard to sleep at night. The worst part was knowing I would do it alone. Not because I had to, because I chose to. I could have asked. I could have called. But I didn't. They have their own bills, I told myself. Their own lives, their own children. I raised them to be strong, to be independent. I didn't want to interrupt that, just because I was no longer any of those things. So I sat at the table with the bill in one hand and the box in the other, and I made the choice. Not because it was easy, but because it was mine. The next morning I wrapped the necklace carefully. Not like something I was selling, but something I was sending off with love. I folded the cloth gently around it, as if tucking it in for one last sleep. I didn't say goodbye, just pressed it to my lips once, and then placed it in my coat pocket. It was a short walk to the pawn shop, but it felt longer than it ever had before. Every step echoed with memories. The sound of my heels on the church steps the day we married, the soft shuffle of slippers as I rocked our first child to sleep, the tap of my cane now on concrete, as if measuring the weight of what was lost. I didn't look back. That's the thing about survival. You don't give yourself that luxury. When I handed over the box, I half expected someone to stop me, for the air to shift, for a voice to cry out, "Wait! Not that one. That's sacred." But the world doesn't work like that. He opened the box, nodded, said the amount. I nodded back. And just like that, something sacred became a transaction. I walked out with money in my hand and an emptiness around my neck I wasn't ready for. That evening after I came home from the pawn shop, I took off my coat and hung it neatly by the door. The pocket where the necklace had rested felt weightless now, like a hollowed-out part of me had been left on that glass counter. I moved around the house in slow, deliberate motions, put the kettle on, folded a dish towel, turned off the hallway light, all the rituals of normal life done without thinking, done to keep from feeling. But when I opened the drawer where the necklace used to sleep, something inside me broke. The little corner where I'd always kept it, nestled beside old receipts from our honeymoon and the dried corsage from our anniversary dinner 20 years ago, now sat empty. The space itself seemed startled, exposed, as if it too didn't know how to live without that quiet gleam of gold. I ran my fingers over the velvet lining and whispered, "I'm sorry." I don't know who I was apologizing to. Maybe to myself, maybe to him. I remembered the day he gave it to me, not with grand fanfare, not with a flourish, but with trembling hands and eyes full of hope. We were sitting on the bed in our first apartment, still poor, still young. He pulled out the necklace and said, "It's not much, but it's ours." I wore it every day for years, through pregnancies, through hospital stays, through funerals, through holidays. I only ever took it off to bathe, and even then I'd place it carefully on the sink like it could hear the water and wanted to stay dry. Even after he passed, I wore it. Some days it felt like the only part of him I had left. Not the house we bought, not the mattress we shared, not the photo albums, though I kept those too, but the necklace, thin, worn warm from my skin, held more of him than anything else. It was the only thing of value I hadn't already given away, the only thing I couldn't give to the kids, because I wasn't ready to let it go. I had always imagined passing it down one day, maybe to my daughter, maybe to a granddaughter if she ever wanted something old and beautiful. I thought it would be part of my legacy, that soft gleam tucked inside a memory box, resting against new skin long after I was gone. But legacies don't pay for EKGs, and heirlooms don't cover blood tests. After I made my tea, I sat down at the table and stared into the steam curling upward. I pressed the mug to my lips and realized something small and painful. I couldn't remember the last time one of my children asked if I needed help. Not real help, not help that required sacrifice. They loved me. I knew they did. But it was the kind of love that lives in text messages and holiday visits, the kind that checks in but doesn't sit down. None of them noticed the necklace was gone, not even when I stopped wearing it. We video called that weekend. I wore a simple blouse buttoned all the way up, hoping they might ask, that someone might squint and say, "Mom, where's your necklace?" No one did. Instead, we talked about school pickups and recipe ideas. They laughed about something on the news. I smiled. I smiled so hard my cheeks hurt. I nodded and nodded even as the silence around my neck screamed. I didn't blame them. That was the worst part. Because deep down, I knew I'd been the one who taught them to look away from pain. I was the one who always said, "Don't worry about me." The one who smiled through exhaustion, through grief, through sleepless nights. I wanted them to be free, to feel unburdened, to know that their mother was strong, indestructible, fine. I became invisible so they could shine. But I didn't expect to disappear entirely. That night, I folded the hospital receipt and placed it neatly into a folder with the others. I wrote the amount paid in careful script, as if documenting the price of survival. Then I tucked the folder away in the bottom drawer. There was no one to show it to. Just me. The first time I saw her, the nurse with the soft eyes and hair pulled into a low bun, I braced myself for another round of questions and clipped words. Hospitals don't usually leave room for tenderness. But she sat next to me, not across from me, and that made all the difference. "You have family?" she asked gently, not as an accusation, not even with pity, just curiosity wrapped in warmth. I hesitated, then nodded. "Yes," I said, "I have children." She smiled. "That's good. They must be a comfort." I smiled too, though I didn't answer. There's a silence women like me learn to perfect a way to smile that doesn't crack open the truth. As she looked over my chart, she noticed my insurance only covered part of the services. She paused, then tilted her head. "You might be eligible for assistance. We have a fund for cases like this. I can help you apply if you'd like." My first reaction was gratitude. My second was shame. I heard myself say, "I'm all right. I'll figure it out." She looked at me for a moment like she wanted to say something, but chose not to. Just nodded and said, "If you change your mind, I'm here." But I knew I wouldn't change my mind. There's something strange about getting older. You get so used to managing to surviving without help that even kindness feels like a spotlight. I'd rather go without than feel like I'm asking for scraps. Maybe it's pride, or maybe it's just exhaustion. I didn't want to be a story for someone else to pity. I didn't want my children to get a phone call saying their mother needed financial aid. I didn't want them to drop everything, not because they were glad to, but because they felt obligated. No, I'd built a life out of making things work. This would be no different. That night back home, I sat on the edge of my bed and thought about the nurse's offer. The idea of someone helping me, a stranger, made something tighten in my throat. I hadn't asked for help in years. Even when my husband was dying, even when the mortgage nearly swallowed us whole, even when I went without new shoes one winter to pay for school books I had never asked. I wore that like a badge, like it made me worthy. But now I wondered, who was that pride really for? When I told the nurse no, I was trying to protect something. My dignity, maybe. My image of myself as a mother who never needed anything in return. But that image felt more like a prison these days than a virtue. I pulled out an old photo album after I'd taken my medication pills paid for in gold. In the photo on the first page, I'm holding my eldest child, smiling so big, my eyes are nearly shut. The necklace glints in the sun, just barely visible under my collar. I traced it with my finger. That was the thing nobody knew how much I gave. Not because they didn't care, but because I never told them. I thought I was being noble, but maybe I was just afraid of being seen. Afraid they'd look too closely and see that the woman they called strong was in truth tired. I turned the pages slowly. Pictures of birthday cakes, school concerts, scraped knees. I was always there, always behind the scenes, sometimes holding the camera. I watched myself age between the snapshots, my hair dark, then graying, then white. The necklace always there, until of course it wasn't. When I closed the album, I whispered the nurse's words to myself, "If you change your mind." But I didn't. Instead, I folded the bills I'd received from the pawn shop and slipped them into a white envelope. No label, no explanation. Just what I needed to pay for what I needed to survive. And still I told no one. They called the next day, 2 of them. One was stuck in traffic. The other needed help finding a recipe. I offered it, of course. I always do. But not one of them asked Mom, "Are you okay?" Not one of them said, "Do you need anything?" And I realized then it wasn't that they didn't care. It was that they didn't know how to. Because I never let them. Sunday used to mean something. For years, Sundays were sacred. Not for church, though I always believed in something higher, but for the phone calls, for the voices of my children bouncing through the line for the catch-up and the "I love you, Mom," before they hung up and went on with their lives. But lately even the calls had become shorter, more distracted. They came in with noise in the background, horns, honking dishes, clattering kids crying, radios playing in the distance. And their voices followed that same rhythm, fast, frantic, always just a bit too loud or too clipped, like they were speaking to me with one hand on something else. "Hi, Mom. Just wanted to check in real quick. We're about to head out to..." I always said, "Take your time," even when they clearly didn't have any to give. That Sunday, I sat on the couch with the receiver already in my lap, waiting. It was nearly noon. The tea had gone cold in my cup, and I'd folded the same dish towel 3 times, just to have something in my hands. When the call finally came, I picked up before the second ring. There was laughter on the other end, not meant for me. One of them, my middle child, was trying to calm the dog while talking to a friend in the room. "Oh, hey, Mom. Sorry. Crazy morning. How are you?" "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just a quiet day." "Good, good. Glad to hear. Listen, I just wanted to say hi. We're about to head out to brunch, but I didn't want to forget. Love you, Mom." Click. The line went dead. I sat there with the hum of the dial tone whispering into my ear, the kind of quiet that feels colder than silence. I placed the phone down and looked around the living room. The old family photos on the mantel stared back, one with all of us at the beach, arms tangled in the kind of closeness that once came so easily. Another from Thanksgiving when we all still gathered under one roof. I tried to remember the last time they all sat at my table, really sat, not just passing through on the way to somewhere else. Years ago, maybe. I looked down at my hand. My fingers still bore the pale line where the wedding ring used to rest. I took it off years after he died when it started catching on things, but I never took off the necklace. That had stayed through it all, until now. And not a single one of them had noticed. That Sunday I didn't answer the second call. I let it ring, watched the number flash on the screen, then fade. There was no message left, just silence. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that makes you wonder if you could vanish and no one would notice until the holidays. I spent the rest of the afternoon quietly. I sliced apples and warmed up some soup, listened to an old record I hadn't played in years, his favorite, the one with the trumpet solo we used to slow dance to in the kitchen after the kids had gone to bed. I thought about calling them back. I even picked up the phone. But then I thought, what would I say? I sold my wedding necklace and nobody noticed. I paid hospital bills with memories. I've been swallowing silence like medicine. No, mothers don't say those things. Not the kind of mother I've been. So instead, I set the phone down, unplugged it, and let the house be still. I went to my bedroom, pulled the faded quilt up to my chest, and stared at the ceiling fan turning slowly above me. The same fan we installed together when the kids were little, when the summer nights felt too hot, and we laughed at how weak it was. Now it hummed a low lullaby, and I listened to it like it might carry me somewhere better. Somewhere where someone would ask and mean it. "How are you really?" But that world wasn't this one. The drawer in the hallway had become a quiet graveyard of old intentions, birthday cards they never picked up, a recipe I clipped for one of them who said they missed my stew, a half-knitted scarf I started after one of them mentioned winter had been colder this year. And the little black velvet box, empty now. I kept it. I couldn't throw it away. That felt too final, too cruel. Instead, I let it rest between envelopes and expired coupons like a relic from a life that had slipped out from under me. Sometimes I'd open the drawer just to glance at it, not to hold it, just to see if I still felt anything. The truth, I always did. I told myself I was foolish, that I should be proud I did what needed to be done, that I had survived again like I always did. But when you sell a piece of your heart to stay alive, it doesn't grow back. It leaves a mark. The necklace wasn't the only thing that had gone unnoticed. There was the time I had a low-grade fever for 5 days straight, and no one came by. I didn't call because I didn't want to bother them. They had enough going on. I drank warm water and wrapped myself in layers and told myself I was strong. And I was. But I was also alone. There were the unopened birthday cards, 4 to be exact, 1 for each child. Written, stamped, addressed, never mailed. I'd meant to send them last year, but something stopped me. A small voice that said, "They'll forget anyway." Or maybe I just didn't want to feel the echo of silence after sending love into the void. I used to write long notes in those cards, personal things, memories, jokes. But over time, the notes grew shorter. Just love, Mom. And eventually, not even that. I pulled the cards out of the drawer one by one, ran my fingers over the edges. I'd written their names in my neatest script, as if handwriting could somehow reach the heart more deeply than words ever could. But they were still here, unsent. That same drawer held a stack of old photos, too, some still glossy, some yellowing at the edges. I lifted one of us in the backyard, the kids climbing over each other like puppies. I remembered how they used to cling to me, tiny hands, sticky kisses, that boundless hunger for attention that only a mother could satisfy. And now I was an afterthought, a background character, a name on their phones they meant to call but rarely did. It wasn't their fault, not entirely. Life happens. People move on. Time stretches and thins, and the bonds that once felt unbreakable begin to fray without anyone meaning to. But the drawer held all the proof that I hadn't moved on. Not really. I'd stayed. I'd waited. I'd hoped. One day I imagined they'd come by, and I'd open that drawer and say I kept these for you, and they'd be touched. They'd say, I didn't know, Mom. I'm sorry. But that day never came. Instead, I dusted the drawer. I placed the cards back, and I closed it gently like tucking a child in for the night. Later, when I made dinner, I set the table for one. I still use the nice dishes sometimes, not for guests, but for myself. Because if I didn't treat myself like I mattered, no one else would. I poured a glass of water, lit a small candle even though it wasn't a special day. The flicker of the flame made the silence feel less sharp. And as I ate, I whispered softly, I remember you. To them, to the necklace, to the woman I used to be. I remembered, even if they didn't. The morning I walked to the pawn shop, the sky was gray but gentle, like it knew something was being laid to rest. My hands trembled inside my coat pockets, clutching the velvet-wrapped necklace one last time. The world moved as it always did. Cars passed. Dogs barked. People laughed into their phones, but none of it touched me. I was walking in a separate rhythm. Each step felt like it echoed in an empty hall, like my own life had pulled slightly away from itself. I reached the corner where the shop sat, a small place tucked between a laundromat and an abandoned florist. The sign above the door buzzed faintly, a dying light, announcing the place where precious things became currency. Inside, it smelled like metal and dust and cold ambition. A man stood behind the counter, the same man I'd seen once before, when I sold a pair of earrings after my husband died. Back then, I told myself it was just a temporary fix, but temporary fixes have a way of becoming permanent when you're a woman aging in silence. He recognized me, I think, though he didn't say it. That was part of the unspoken transaction. No questions, no judgments, just price and pain neatly separated. I placed the box down with a kind of reverence, like I was handing over a life, not a thing. He opened it, glanced inside, and gave a slow nod. "This is a good piece," he said. I nodded. It was. He weighed it, wrote something down, then turned the screen toward me with the offer. I looked at the number. It didn't match the worth, not in the way I understood worth, but it matched what I needed, enough to cover the bills, the medication, the follow-up. "I'll take it," I whispered. He counted the cash in quiet motions. I could hear each bill folding like pages in a book that would never be read again. He slid them toward me. I took them. My hands didn't tremble anymore. They were still. It wasn't peace, but it was done. I left the shop without looking back, not because I wasn't tempted, but because I knew if I did, I'd run, and I couldn't afford that. Walking home, I passed a bakery we used to visit. There was a mother and her daughter in the window, sharing a slice of cake. The girl had chocolate on her nose. and the mother wiped it away with a napkin, laughing. I had been that mother once. I walked a little faster. At home, I placed the money in a plain white envelope, wrote the amount on the back. No memo, no flourish, just the quiet satisfaction of knowing I could pay. Then I went to the kitchen. I made stew their favorite. I peeled the carrots, chopped the onions, stirred the pot with care. I even made fresh bread the way I used to when they were little, and the smell alone could bring them running to the table. It took hours, but I didn't mind. Work is easier than grief. That evening, 2 of them dropped by, said they were in the area just for a moment. I smiled, said how nice it was to see them, invited them in. They stayed for 5 minutes, didn't sit, said the stew smelled good, but they'd already eaten. One of them scrolled through their phone while I offered a jar to take home. "Thanks, Mom," they said. "You're always so thoughtful." I nodded. I didn't mention the necklace. Didn't say I'd sold it for the bill I hadn't told them about. Didn't say that while they chatted about gas prices and weekend plans, I was remembering how it felt to be touched on the collarbone by a man who once called me his light. They left in a flurry of hugs and half-meant words. The door closed and I stood in the hallway for a moment holding the jar they forgot to take. I placed it in the fridge. Later that night, I sat on the porch with a blanket wrapped around my legs, the steam of tea rising up into the air like a ghost. My neckline felt cold, not from the weather, but from absence. I touched it anyway out of habit. My fingers brushed empty skin. I thought about the pawn shop, the mother and daughter in the bakery, the stew cooling on the stove, and I whispered to the dark, "I hope one day they'll know what it cost." The day after they visited, I reheated the stew, ate it alone at the kitchen table with the TV murmuring in the background, not loud enough to listen to, just loud enough to pretend I wasn't sitting in silence. It still tasted good, warm, familiar, like something I could lean against, but the flavors sat differently in my mouth now, seasoned with memory instead of joy. I remembered how years ago they used to fight over the last piece of bread, how they used to laugh, mouths full, cheeks red from the heat of the stove and the safety of being home. I always told them, "One day you'll understand." I used to believe that. I used to believe time would circle back around, that once they were grown, they'd come to know the shape of everything I'd carried, that maybe they'd stop long enough to look back to really see me, not as the woman who packed their lunches or ironed their shirts, but as someone who was once young, who gave up everything without calling it a sacrifice. But they hadn't understood, not really. Not when they walked into the kitchen and didn't notice my necklace was missing. Not when they hugged me like an afterthought and said, "Thanks again, Mom." That phrase, "thanks again." I thought about it long after they left. It wasn't unkind. It wasn't cruel. But it was hollow. They didn't know what they were thanking me for. That night I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, looking at my reflection. I wore a simple house dress, my hair clipped back loosely. My collarbone looked bare exposed. I touched the spot where the necklace used to lie, where his fingers used to trace just before he kissed me good morning. I spoke softly to my reflection. "You did the right thing, even if no one saw it." There's a strange dignity in doing the right thing when no one is watching. It doesn't feel glorious. It doesn't feel noble. It just feels quiet. And in that quiet, I began to notice something else. I had started talking to myself more, not in madness, in survival. I whispered things while folding laundry. I narrated my movements while peeling potatoes. I spoke to the woman I had become, as if she were a stranger who needed kindness. "Let's rest now. You did your best today. It's okay to feel tired." There was no one else to say these things, and someone had to. I went to the living room and sat in my usual chair, The fabric was worn down where my arms always rested. I watched the streetlights flicker on outside one by one like old friends keeping watch. I thought of calling one of the kids, just to talk, just to ask about their day. But I knew how it would go. They'd answer. They'd be kind. But their voices would carry that edge of hurry, that ripple of, I don't have long. So I didn't call. I picked up my knitting instead, the same scarf I'd abandoned in the drawer. My fingers moved slowly at first, remembering the rhythm. Loop, pull, slide. Loop, pull, slide. The yarn wrapped itself around my hands like something soft and obedient. As I worked, I let my mind drift. I thought of the hospital bill now paid. I thought of the empty box still tucked away. I thought of all the meals I'd made that week and all the conversations that didn't happen. I thought of love, how it changes, how it hides, how it leaves. And I realized something both simple and hard. I had never once asked them to see me. Not truly. Not as a woman who dreams aches remembers. I had always made it easy for them to look away, to believe I was fine, to believe I didn't need anything more than their occasional presence and hollow gratitude. I made invisibility look like strength. And now I was paying for it with quiet evenings and a cold neckline. But I wasn't angry, not exactly. I was just awake. For the first time in a long time, I saw the space I occupied, not just as their mother, but as a person, a woman, a life. It was a few weeks later when we gathered for a family photo. One of them had organized it, said it had been too long, that we needed something nice for the holiday cards. I agreed, of course. I always agree. They came in pairs, one with their spouse, another with a toddler, whose hands left sticky marks on my walls. I didn't mind. I liked the sound of footsteps, the clatter of shoes by the door. I liked feeling the air shift with conversation, even if I wasn't at the center of it. I wore a soft cream blouse, simple, clean, elegant in a way that didn't draw attention. I looked at myself in the mirror before leaving my bedroom and noticed again the absence. No necklace, just a quiet empty dip at the base of my throat. And still not one of them noticed. We stood in the garden where my husband used to trim the hedges every spring. The sun filtered through the leaves just enough to soften our faces, and we smiled for the camera like people who had nothing to forgive. The photographer, a young woman with kind eyes, took a few test shots and then said, "Okay, on 3, say family." We said it, all of us. I said it quietly. Later, when they sent the photos to me for approval, I stared at that image longer than I expected to. Everyone looked happy, even me. If you didn't know the story, you'd believe it was a picture of closeness, of love. But all I could see was my bare neck. The first holiday photo without the necklace. I wondered if he'd notice if he were still here. He always noticed. Even when I wore a new color, he'd smile and say, "That suits you." The absence of that gold strand in the picture wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. It was a ghost of what had once been a vow, now reduced to a receipt folded in a drawer. I didn't cry. I didn't feel sad exactly. I just felt suspended. It was as if I were both in the picture and outside of it, a part of the moment and also a witness to it. After they left, I tidied up, put the cushions back, wiped the table, collected empty cups from every room like I always had. On one of the plates, someone had left a piece of cake, uneaten. I wrapped it in plastic, placed it in the fridge, and labeled it, even though I knew no one would come back for it. That evening, I lit a candle by my bedside and looked again at the family photo. And for the first time, I spoke aloud what had only lived in the back of my mind until then. They don't see what's missing. Not because they're cruel, but because I never let them learn how to look. I had raised them to focus on the outer things, grades, jobs, good manners, clean homes. I hadn't taught them how to see pain that isn't loud, how to listen when someone says they're fine, but their eyes are searching for something to hold on to. That was my failing, not theirs. I placed the photo frame face down on the dresser, not because I didn't love them, but because I couldn't look at myself pretending anymore. The next morning, I dressed differently. A sweater with a collar that rose just high enough to cover the place where the necklace had once sat. I made oatmeal, fed the birds, sat by the window. And for once I didn't think about who might call. I just let the quiet in. Because sometimes the loudest pain is not being asked, what did it cost you? And sometimes the deepest dignity is knowing without being seen that you paid it anyway. The pills sat lined up neatly by the sink, like tiny soldiers waiting for my command. I'd gotten them filled with the money from the necklace, 12 white tablets in a little amber bottle, each one a promise of a steadier heartbeat, and one more day where I didn't feel like I was falling apart from the inside out. I picked one up, swallowed it dry. I'd forgotten to fill the glass. It didn't matter. I'd grown used to doing things without ceremony. It was strange taking medicine that had cost me something sacred. It felt almost transactional, like every dose came stamped with a memory I didn't ask for, but one I carried anyway. I looked at the receipt again, folded 3 times in the drawer by the fridge. The pharmacy had printed it on thin paper that curled at the edges, but the total was still bold. $142 or 67. Covered for now, but not forgotten. There was no dramatic moment of relief when I took the pills, no magic hour where I suddenly felt whole again. Healing, I've learned, is a quiet thing. It creeps up on you, like grief, but in reverse. I moved slower those days, not from weakness, but from something else, something heavier. I sat outside more often. The porch had become my church, my place of communion with the past, with memory, with the woman I used to be. I remembered the weight of the necklace, how it used to rest against my skin with a soft confidence, like it knew it belonged there. Some mornings I still reached for it instinctively. My fingers would graze my neck and pause, confused, and then I'd remember. And then I'd take my medicine. None of the kids asked how I got it. One of them called and mentioned how expensive prescriptions were these days. I laughed a little too quietly for them to notice and said, "Yes, they are." That was all. They didn't ask, "But how did you manage, Mom?" Because I never told them I was struggling. I never said I don't have enough. I never once said I'm scared. They still believed I was fine. The image I'd built of the strong, selfless mother had taken root so deeply, even I sometimes forgot to uproot it. I didn't blame them, not fully. But part of me wished just once that someone would look past the smiles and the small talk and see that my medicine came with a cost, that survival came with a receipt I hadn't shown anyone. Later that week, I had a doctor's appointment, a follow-up. They checked my heart, listened to the rhythm of my breath. The nurse smiled and said, "Everything's stable. You're doing great." I nodded, thanked her. On the way out, I saw a woman in the waiting room, probably my age. She was filling out forms with shaking hands, her purse spilling over with papers and tissues. I recognized the look in her eyes, the quiet panic of someone trying to figure out how to afford both health and dignity. I wanted to sit beside her. I wanted to say, "I know. I've been there. You're not invisible." But I didn't, because I knew the silence too well, knew how fiercely we cling to it. Instead, I walked past her slower than usual. Maybe she saw the recognition in my eyes, maybe not. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table again. I sliced an apple and arranged it on a plate just like I used to do when my children were small. The act felt ceremonial, almost holy. And then I whispered aloud to no one, The pills are working. Not in a triumphant way, not with celebration. Just a quiet truth. A truth paid for with gold, with memory, with a silence so deep even my bones felt it. And yet I was still here, still alive, still a woman who chose to bear the weight so they wouldn't have to. Christmas came with its usual flurry cards in the mail commercials, humming in every store songs I used to sing while baking sugar cookies for tiny hands that no longer needed help cracking eggs. They came this year, all of them, one after the other, spilling into the house with coats and boots and gift bags, the air filled with noise, again chatter, and children, and the scent of pine from the candle I lit to make the place feel more festive. I made cocoa, I prepared the ham, I baked the same spiced bread I've baked for the last 25 Christmases. No one asked how long I stood over the stove. No one noticed the ache in my back. They brought gifts, socks, slippers, a novelty mug that said "Best Mom Ever" in glittering letters. I smiled and said thank you. Of course I did. But inside something curled inward, not out of greed, not even disappointment. Just a quiet ache for being truly seen. Because what I wanted, what I had always wanted, was not a mug or fuzzy socks. It was for someone to take my hand, look into my eyes, and say, "Mom, how are you? Really? Do you have enough? What did it cost you to get here?" But that question never came. Instead, they told me about new jobs, promotions, school awards. They handed me wrapping paper and joked about how bad they were at folding. They complimented the food, devoured it, and kissed me quickly on the cheek before rushing off to their next celebration. When the house was quiet again, I stood at the sink washing dishes long after midnight. The steam rose from the hot water, fogging the window in front of me. My hands moved on their own, scrubbing and rinsing the way they had for decades. I looked down at the novelty mug in the drying rack. Best mom ever. I laughed. Not cruelly, not bitterly, just softly, like someone watching a movie they've seen 1,000 times, knowing exactly how it ends. I wiped my hands on a towel and walked to the drawer, the one with the receipts, the medicine, the empty necklace box. I opened it and stared. The velvet still held the faintest imprint where the chain had rested for so many years. I took out the box, closed it tightly, and ran my hand across the top. Then I placed it back inside, this time deeper under some folded linens. Maybe it was time to stop opening it at all. I turned off the lights and walked down the hallway in darkness, the same hallway where little feet used to run on Christmas morning, dragging blankets and stuffed animals behind them, squealing about Santa and cinnamon rolls. Now the silence wrapped around me like a heavy shawl. Familiar. Expected. In my bedroom, I lit one small candle and sat on the edge of the bed. The slippers fit well. The socks were warm. But warmth is not the same as care. And softness is not the same as love. They meant well. I believed that. But intention without attention leaves a mark just the same. And the part that stung most wasn't their failure to see. It was the truth I'd begun to admit to myself, that I had always made it so easy not to look, that I had tucked my needs beneath theirs so seamlessly they never knew they were stepping over them, that my silence had become their permission. But this year, this Christmas, I felt the shift, not from them, from me. The old me would have folded the mug back into its box for safekeeping, would have sent thank you cards with sparkly stickers, would have pretended the ache in her chest was heartburn or weather. But that night I left the mug in the cupboard and said aloud, "You don't see me, but I'm still here." And the words didn't echo. They settled, like truth finally allowed to breathe. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles after the holidays. It isn't peaceful, it's hollow. the kind that fills a house like dust in sunlight, floating in places no one bothers to clean. The decorations stayed up longer this year. I didn't have the energy to take them down. The tinsel on the banister drooped like it knew no one would be climbing the stairs but me. The tree, artificial and too perfect, stood blinking in the corner for weeks after New Year's Day. I turned the lights on in the evenings, not for festivity, but for company. January always brings reflection, but this year it brought reckoning. I kept thinking about what no one had asked. No one had asked how I was affording things. No one had asked about the doctor's visits, the quiet absence of the necklace I'd worn nearly every day of their lives. They noticed the lights I put up, the presents, the food. But they didn't notice what was missing. I used to defend them to myself, still do sometimes. They're busy. They're trying. They love you. And maybe all of that is true. But love that doesn't look closely is no longer love, it's habit. And I was tired of being a habit. One evening, as I folded laundry with the news murmuring in the background, I caught myself whispering again. Not to anyone, just to the air. I don't think they know me anymore. The words startled me, not because they were new, but because they were finally allowed out. When had I become a stranger in their lives? Maybe it started when I stopped asking for help, or when I smiled through things I should have spoken about, or maybe it began the moment I decided motherhood meant silence. I thought I was doing it right. I thought love meant giving until you disappeared. But now, sitting on my bed folding their old sweatshirts I still wore on cold nights, I realized something painful. You can't teach people how to love you by hiding what hurts. You can't spend a lifetime whispering I'm fine and expect someone to ask, but are you really? I stood and walked to the mirror. The woman looking back at me was not the girl who wore that necklace for the first time. She was older now, softer in places, sharper in others. Her eyes were still kind, but they carried weight, not bitterness, just history. And I said to her gently, "They never knew, did they?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to. I sat down and pulled out my old journal. I hadn't written in months, maybe longer. My handwriting had changed over the years, smaller, shakier, but the voice was still mine. I began to write what I'd never spoken aloud. I sold my wedding necklace to pay hospital bills. No one asked how I paid. No one noticed it was gone. I didn't tell them. And maybe that's on me. The pen moved slowly, like it was walking me somewhere. But I miss being seen. I miss being asked the kind of questions that tell you someone wants the real answer. I miss hearing, "Thank you, Mom, for everything." Not just because it's polite, but because they meant it. The page filled with soft truths, none of them angry, just real. And when I finished, I closed the journal and placed it beneath my pillow. No one would read it, but it existed, and that mattered. I looked around the room, the candle burning low, the folded clothes in a neat pile, the quiet hum of the night pressing against the windows, and I whispered, "I don't need them to know everything, but I need me to remember. Because the worst kind of forgetting isn't when they forget you. It's when you forget yourself. Sometimes in the early hours before the sun pushes itself over the horizon, I whisper things into the quiet. Words I would never say out loud to anyone else. Words that feel too tender, too true. Like I'm tired of being brave. I wish someone would just hold my hand. I miss being someone's everything. These whispers don't go anywhere. They don't bounce off the walls or echo down the hallway. They land inside me like soft stones, settling in deep water. I've begun speaking to myself more often now, not out of loneliness, though it's there, but because I am the only one who has stayed. Through every storm, every ache, every sacrifice, I stayed. There's something quietly defiant about surviving this long, something noble in waking up every day and feeding the birds and making the bed and setting the table for one. Not because it makes sense, but because it's a promise to yourself, a whisper that says, you still matter. I started walking again, just around the block slowly with my coat buttoned up tight and a scarf tucked around my neck where the necklace used to rest. The rhythm of my steps is meditative, one foot, then the other. A neighbor waved at me the other day. I smiled back. She didn't ask where I'd been and I didn't offer, but something about her glance lingered, a flicker of recognition, the kind that says, I see you, even if she didn't know what she was seeing. I came home and made tea, sat on the porch, let the steam kiss my face while the wind tousled the dead leaves at my feet. Inside the house, everything was still. No beeping phones, no voices, no urgency. I went to the drawer again, not out of longing this time, but out of finality. I took out the empty velvet box, sat with it in my lap, ran my fingers across its soft edges. And then I whispered, it was never about the gold. It never was. It was about what it symbolized, love, promise, permanence, all things that life slowly teaches you to let go of, but not dignity. Know that I still have. And I realized maybe they'll never ask. Maybe they'll never know what I gave, what I sold, what I buried, so they could rise. But I will not vanish quietly. Not in my own eyes. I placed the box in a small wooden chest where I kept letters from my husband's old recipes and a few faded birthday drawings from the kids. I wrapped it in tissue and closed the lid. A private burial, a soft goodbye. Not because I was letting go of him, but because I was making room for me. That night, as I brushed my teeth, I looked at myself in the mirror and didn't flinch. I saw a woman who still showed up for her home, for her memories, for herself. And I said aloud, you are still here. You are still whole, and you deserve softness, even if you must give it to yourself. Then I turned off the light, walked down the hall barefoot, and settled into bed. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't wish for a call. I wished for peace, and found it. They'll never know. They'll never know that the gold necklace I wore for 40 years now sits in someone else's hands, glinting under pawn shop lights, its story erased, and its meaning discarded for weight and carrots. They'll never know how I stood in line behind a man trading a watch and a woman clutching a baby stroller, my memories pressed into velvet in my pocket. They'll never know that I sat at my kitchen table, counting out the bills I was too ashamed to ask for help paying, that I boiled water for tea instead of turning on the heat, because I didn't want the gas bill to rise again. That I closed the curtains not to keep the cold out, but to hide the growing smallness of my world. They'll never know I whispered their names every night before sleep like a prayer, not for them to call, just for them to remember. They'll never know that while they talked about vacation homes and birthday parties, I watched my own memories retreat into dust-covered drawers and empty picture frames. Because I never told them. And maybe that's what this has always been about. Not betrayal, not anger, not even loneliness. But the silence I wrapped myself in so tightly for so long that I became invisible even to myself. I thought I was doing the right thing, keeping my troubles to myself, being the strong one, never asking, never needing. I thought that's what mothers were supposed to do. But there comes a day when silence becomes a wound, and healing begins with telling the truth, if only to yourself. So here it is. I sold the necklace, I paid the bills, I lived through it. And I am still here. Not because someone saved me, but because I saved myself. I looked at the mirror again this morning, my collarbone bare, and I didn't flinch. There was a time when I thought the necklace gave me something identity connection proof that I had once been chosen, cherished. But now I see what remained after it was gone. Me. The woman who held everything together when no one noticed. The woman who fed them, clothed them, forgave them. The woman who swallowed heartache like it was air and still managed to plant flowers in the spring. The woman who was never thanked, properly, never asked the right questions, never truly seen. But who saw herself now? And that is enough. It has to be. I am no longer waiting for recognition. I am no longer trying to prove my worth in silence. I am simply being, breathing, and finding softness again, even if no one else ever knows the cost. The candle flickers quietly on the nightstand, now its light swaying in slow rhythms against the wall, casting long shadows that stretch like memories. My hands rest in my lap, still worn but no longer clenched. There's peace in this stillness, a kind of peace that doesn't come from being praised or remembered. It comes from release. I gave them everything I had, and for a long time I waited for someone to notice. But now I understand that the noticing begins with me, that I was always waiting for the wrong eyes to see. And in the end, maybe it was never about being known by them. Maybe it was about choosing to know myself again. I sit quietly now, not in bitterness, but in calm. The kind of calm that comes when you finally stop trying to be understood by those who never learned how to listen. I touch the hollow at my neck where the necklace used to lie, and I smile. Not because I'm forgetting, but because I remember everything. And I survived it. And I forgave it. And I let it go. Not all at once, but inch by inch, breath by breath, whisper by whisper. The house is quiet, but it's not empty. It holds a woman who gave everything and found her way back to herself. Not with noise, not with rage, but with a soft, steady grace. I didn't need to be loud. I just needed to leave. They forgot me, but I never forgot myself. And in the silence I found peace.